All right, so are you ready to really go deep on this one? We've got a whole bunch of interesting stuff on Trump and Greenland,
Oh, yeah.
like news clips, analyses, even some historical parallels. And trust me, it's a lot more than just some rich guy wanting to buy an island. There's way more to it than that.
Yeah, it's like one of those icebergs, you know? What you see on the surface is just the tip of the iceberg.
Right, exactly. Okay, so let's just start with what everyone's been talking about, Trump wanting to buy Greenland. He keeps bringing it up, and he's not just joking around. He's even saying it's a national security issue. What do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting. By calling it a national security issue, it kind of makes it sound more important than just a real estate deal.
So it's more than just adding another state.
Yeah, and to really get why this is happening, you have to understand how important Greenland is strategically, especially with everything that's going on in the Arctic right now.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Why is Greenland so important strategically?
Well, think about where it is. It's right in the middle of these shipping routes in the Arctic that are opening up because of climate change.
Right.
And these new routes could really change things. Ships could go between Asia and Europe weeks faster, and whoever controls those routes will have a big advantage.
So it's like the Panama Canal, but with ice. I get why that's a big deal, but it can't just be about location, right?
Oh, you're right. Greenland is also thought to have a ton of untapped resources. We're talking oil, natural gas, and these things called rare earth minerals. These minerals are super important for technology, like the phones we use every day, and even military stuff.
Okay, so Greenland has valuable resources, a really important location, and a U.S. president who wants it. It's no wonder everyone's talking about this. But is buying Greenland even possible?
Well, there's some big roadblocks. The first one is Denmark. Greenland is part of Denmark, and they've said over and over again that it's not for sale. It's not just something you can buy and sell like that.
Right, and it's not just Denmark's decision either. Greenland has a lot of self-governance. The people there might not want to become part of the U.S.
Exactly. And they get a lot of money from Denmark and the European Union. So independence might be more appealing to them.
So it's like a tug of war between Denmark, Greenland, and the U.S. And then there's all these potentially huge resources. Let's talk more about those. What exactly are they and why are they so valuable?
When you hear rare earth minerals, it might sound like something out of a sci-fi movie.
Yeah.
But this stuff is what all our technology is made of. Like neodymium, you need that for the magnets in wind turbines and in electric car motors. And then there's dysprosium that's used in the lasers for fiber optic cables that make the internet work.
Wow. So these aren't just random rocks. They're what makes our world run.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Greenland is thought to have maybe half of the world's supply of some of these super important minerals. That's why everyone's so interested in it.
Okay, so we've got valuable resources, a strategic location, and lots of political gamesmanship. But getting those resources out of a place like Greenland can't be easy.
You're telling me it's a logistical nightmare? There's hardly any infrastructure. It's a huge area and the environment is brutal. You need special technology and people who know what they're doing. It's not like just setting up shop in some nice warm place.
And what about the environment? Extracting resources in the Arctic could really damage the ecosystem there, right?
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
You can't just start digging and drilling without thinking about the environment and the people who live there.
Speaking of history, isn't this like the second time the U.S. has tried to get Greenland? Didn't something similar happen way back in the 1800s?
Yeah, back in 1867, there was this proposal to Congress about buying Greenland.
Really? What were they after back then?
Well, some things never change. They wanted those resources. They saw all the fish, the coal, the mountains of sulfur. But here's the thing, they were already thinking about Arctic shipping routes. Even back then, they knew those routes could be really important.
Wow, so it's the same stuff today. Resources, location, shipping routes. It's crazy how history repeats itself.
It really is. And that history can help us understand what's happening now. And speaking of what's happening now, we have to talk about China.
Right, China's been doing a lot in the Arctic lately. They've got their own plans up there, right?
Big time. They've been investing in Arctic infrastructure and development as part of their Polar Silk Road plan. They want to make new trade routes through the Arctic, and Greenland is a big part of that.
So it's not just about the resources for China. They're trying to change global trade and become a major power in the Arctic. It's like a big chess game, and Greenland is a really valuable piece.
Exactly. And the U.S. is watching what China is doing. They're worried about China's influence, their military, and their control over those shipping routes.
So the Arctic is like this new frontier where everyone is competing, and Greenland is right in the middle of it all. It seems like whatever happens there will affect the whole world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to understand it all, we need to look at it from Greenland's perspective. They're not just a pawn in this game. They have their own goals and ideas.
That's a good point. It's easy to forget about the people who actually live there.
Totally.
Yeah.
And understanding their point of view is really important for figuring out what's going to happen next.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground already. You've given us a lot to think about. Let's take a quick break, and when we get back, we'll talk about Greenland's perspective and what might happen next.
So, everyone's probably wondering what the Greenlanders think about all this.
Yeah, I'm curious.
It's kind of complicated. On the one hand, they see how more investment and resource development could help their economy.
Right.
But on the other hand, they really want to be in control of their own future. They don't want to be dependent on anyone else.
Makes sense. They don't want to just trade one colonial power for another. They want to decide their own fate.
Exactly. And that's where this whole independence movement comes in. They see all this attention as a chance to get a better deal for themselves, whether that's with Denmark, the U.S., China, or even on their own.
So how would independence actually change things? What would it mean for Greenland and everyone else?
Imagine Greenland as its own country, controlling its own resources, making its own decisions about foreign policy and who they do business with. That would be a huge shift in power in the Arctic.
It would definitely shake things up. Suddenly, Greenland's calling the shots. They could be negotiating deals with superpowers. It's like something out of a movie.
It's a really interesting idea.
Yeah.
And it's becoming more and more likely. And it's not just about politics and resources. The people of Greenland, mostly the Inuit, have lived in this harsh but beautiful place for centuries. Their culture and traditions are tied to the land and sea. Any decisions about Greenland's future have to respect that.
That's a really important point. We can't forget about the people who actually live there. What are some of their main concerns?
One big concern is the environment. They've seen how climate change is affecting their hunting and fishing grounds. They want to make sure that any development is done sustainably and doesn't ruin their way of life.
That's understandable. They're the ones who would be most affected by any environmental damage.
Right. And they're also worried about protecting their culture and language. They don't want to lose their identity in all this globalization and outside influence.
It sounds like Greenland is in a tough spot. They have the chance to become really important, but they also have to deal with international relations, internal politics, and cultural preservation. That's a lot to handle.
It is. And one of the most fascinating things about this is that it's all happened before. Remember that proposal to buy Greenland back in 1867?
Yeah, it's amazing how we're seeing the same motivations today. Resources, strategic locations, shipping routes. It's like history repeating itself, but with higher stakes this time.
Totally. And that historical context can help us understand what's going on now.
So let's go back to that 1867 proposal. What were the main arguments for the U.S. buying Greenland back then?
Well, the report that was presented to Congress said there were a lot of benefits. They saw Greenland as a source of valuable resources like coal, sulfur, and cryolite. Cryolite was really important for making aluminum back then.
So resources were a big factor even then. Were they also thinking about the strategic location and the possibility of Arctic shipping routes?
You might be surprised to hear that they were. The report talked about steamships sailing from Greenland's northern ports in the summer. They saw the potential for Greenland to become a hub for trade and transportation in the Arctic, even with the technology they had at the time.
Wow, they were really thinking ahead. They knew the Arctic was important even before climate change made it a reality.
It goes to show you that some things never change. And just like the U.S. saw potential in Greenland back then, another major power is doing the same thing today. China.
Right. We talked about China's Polar Silk Road plan earlier. Can you tell us more about that? What are they trying to do, and how does Greenland fit into their plans?
So as the ice melts, it opens up new routes for ships. China wants to make new trade routes through the Arctic. These routes would be much faster for shipping between Asia, Europe, and North America.
So it's more than just controlling resources for China. They're thinking about changing global trade and becoming a major player in the Arctic.
Exactly. And Greenland, with its location and potential deep water ports, is a key part of their plan. They've been putting a lot of money into infrastructure and resource development in Greenland, and that's making the U.S. nervous.
So you've got this rivalry between the U.S. and China, and Greenland is caught in the middle. It's a tricky situation.
Definitely. And it requires careful thought and understanding of everyone's perspective.
Oh. We've talked about the U.S. possibly getting more involved, Greenland's potential independence, and the U.S. and China competing for influence. Are there any other things we should keep in mind?
One thing that people often forget about is climate change. It's not just opening up new shipping routes. It's also making it easier to extract resources that could make investing in Greenland even more attractive. As the ice melts, it's easier to get to those valuable minerals, which could lead to more competition for control over Greenland.
So climate change is actually making things more complicated. It's making those resources more accessible, but it's also raising the stakes and the risks.
Yeah. Exactly. And it brings up some big questions about the environment. Can we develop the Arctic's resources without destroying this fragile ecosystem? That's something Greenland will have to think carefully about.
It's a tough decision to make, especially with all the pressure from other countries and economic interests. It feels like we're entering uncharted territory.
You're right. The Arctic is becoming a hotspot for global competition, resource extraction, and climate change. And Greenland is at the heart of it all.
Okay, so to recap for our listener, we've been exploring the world of Greenland. It's a place that's incredibly important strategically with valuable resources, a fascinating history, and a future that's still uncertain.
Exactly. And remember, this is a story that's still going on. Keep an eye on what happens in the Arctic because the decisions made there will affect Greenland and the rest of the world.
Well, let's talk about those scenarios. What are some of the things that could happen?
One possibility is that the U.S., even if they don't buy Greenland, really ramps up their involvement. Like more military presence, more economic partnerships, basically trying to make sure they have the most influence there.
So like becoming Greenland's best friend, but with benefits. But wouldn't that make things worse with other countries that want influence like China?
It's tricky. Using soft power means trying to influence things through economics and culture, not the military. But you're right, it could turn into a competition with everyone trying to outdo each other. And that could make things unstable for Greenland to make it harder for them to do what they want.
And what about Greenland becoming independent? How would that change things?
If Greenland breaks away from Denmark, everything changes. They would control all their resources and their foreign policy. They would be a major player on the world stage. They could make deals with superpowers and use that to get the best for themselves.
That's kind of wild. Imagine a new country, Greenland, controlling all these valuable resources and making deals with the US, China, Russia, EU. The whole world would look different.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to what's happening in the Arctic. What happens in the next few years will affect Greenland and the whole world.
We've talked about the U.S. getting more involved, Greenland becoming independent, and the U.S. and China competing. Are there any other things we should be thinking about?
One thing that people don't always think about is climate change. It's not just about new shipping routes. It's also making it easier to get those resources. As the ice melts, it's easier to get to those valuable minerals. And that could make the competition for Greenland even more intense.
So climate change is making everything more complicated. The resources are easier to get to, but the risks are higher.
Exactly. And it raises some big questions about the environment. Can we develop the Arctic without destroying it? That's something Greenland will have to decide.
It's a tough decision. With all the pressure from other countries and the economic possibilities, it feels like we're in uncharted waters.
Absolutely. The Arctic is becoming the center of attention for global competition, resources, and climate change. And Greenland is right in the middle of it all.
So for our listeners, we've given you a deep dive into Greenland. It's a strategically important place with incredible resources, a fascinating history, and a very uncertain future. That's right. It's a story that's still being written. Pay attention to what happens in the Arctic, because the decisions made there will have huge consequences for Greenland and the rest of us.
And there you have it, folks. A deep dive into the Greenland situation. A story of international politics, valuable resources, climate change, and the struggle for control over a vital region. A story with no easy answers and a lot of uncertainty. But one thing's for sure, it's a story that you need to be paying attention to, because what happens next could change everything.